Dr. Elias Marrow had spent 30 years wandering through the graveyards of history-ruined empires, forgotten nations, and once mighty powers now reduced to footnotes. He wasn't famous. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't even well-liked in academic circles. But he had one thing no one else had: the patience to see connections others ignored. His obsession began when he was a young researcher studying the fall of Spain. He noticed strange similarities patterns that kept surfacing in documents centuries apart. Years later, while analyzing Britain's imperial decline, he saw the same rhythms. And when he dug into the USSR's collapse, the pattern became unavoidable. It felt as if every great nation walked the same invisible staircase downward. Over time, he crystallized his findings into what he called the seven-stage collapse pattern. Ascendancy, a nation's rise through innovation and unity. Expansion, influence spreads, wealth increases. Golden consolidation, cultural and economic peak. Stagnation, innovation slows, institutions resist change. Internal fragmentation, society becomes polarized. Institutional breakdown, governance fails, systems crack. Dissolution or rebirth, the final collapse or a rare transformation. For decades, Elias refined his theory in private, afraid it would be dismissed as doomsaying. But one morning, while reviewing current indicators, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. The Union of Avalon, UA, the world's strongest superpower, had quietly entered Stage 5. The signs were everywhere: cultural distrust, regional tensions, collapsing public faith in institutions. He realized the UA was following the exact same trajectory as past fallen giants, but at a faster pace. If the stages continued as they always had, Stage 6 and 7 were no longer distant possibilities. They were approaching realities. For the first time in his life, Elias felt fear not for himself, but for the millions living inside a machine heading toward its own unmaking. He decided to publish his findings. He gathered his data, prepared graphs, compiled centuries of parallels, and submitted his work to major academic journals. He braced himself for debate, criticism, maybe even controversy. Instead, he was mocked. Editors rejected him. Colleagues laughed in his face. A well-known historian went on television to call his theory the ramblings of a panic-stricken recluse. Elias expected resistance, but not cruelty. Still, he pressed on. He gave public lectures, wrote articles, even recorded videos explaining the pattern in simple terms. Then the pushback changed shape. Instead of academics, government representatives began contacting him, first politely, then persistently. They warned that he was fueling instability and misinterpreting harmless data. When he refused to retract his research, the threats grew sharper. Grants vanished. His university contract was quietly terminated. His house was searched under the guise of a clerical error. Realizing he was being silenced, Elias encrypted all his work and sent it to the only person he trusted, Mira Calder, his sharpest former student and now an investigative journalist. The next day, he disappeared. When Mira Calder received the encrypted files from her old mentor, she assumed they were research notes, maybe a draft of a new book. Elias Marrow was brilliant but notoriously dramatic. She didn't expect anything truly shocking. But the moment she opened the first folder, her heartbeat quickened. These weren't academic notes, they were warnings. Thousands of documents, maps, trend charts, interviews, and private correspondences lay before her, labeled with a single ominous header: Stage 5 Indicators, the Union of Avalon. Mira began reading. At first, the signs seemed subtle, tiny fractures in the massive structure of the Union. But as she dug deeper, the cracks widened, forming a picture she could no longer ignore. Entire regions were quietly resisting federal mandates. Some states enacted contradictory laws, daring the central government to challenge them. Infrastructure failures, bridges, rail lines, power grids were increasing. Yet official reports insisted everything is under control. Government transparency dropped sharply while private corporations gained extraordinary influence, funding entire departments and steering policy in their favor. One file chilled her, a memo revealing that 2 government agencies had begun creating their own contingency protocols, effectively forming shadow administrations in case the Union fractured. Myra's investigative instincts awakened. She cross-referenced Elias's research with public data. The pattern matched perfectly. Avalon's institutions were losing coherence, each functioning independently, sometimes against one another. It was the precise definition of Stage 5, internal fragmentation. Still, Myra hesitated. Elias had been attacked and discredited. Could she suffer the same fate? But curiosity and a sense of responsibility overpowered fear. She published her first article, Is Avalon Approaching a Historical Crossroads? It didn't accuse. It didn't predict collapse. It simply asked questions. Within hours, it exploded across the country. Some hailed her as a truth seeker. Others condemned her as an alarmist. Political commentators dissected her article on live broadcasts. Social media ignited with debate. Myra's name trended for 3 days. Then the strange things began. Her phone glitched, rebooting without warning. She received anonymous emails with subject lines like "Stop" or "You've been noticed." Drones, small, silent, barely visible, hovered near her apartment window late at night. She dismissed the first as coincidence, but not the second or third. When her car was remotely disabled on a highway, forcing her to wait for assistance in the dark, she understood it fully. Someone was watching her. Someone who didn't want Elias's files reaching the public. Driven now by both fear and defiance, Myra dug deeper into the encrypted folders. She found interviews with ex-officials describing internal federal conflicts. She found classified reports showing a decline in public trust at levels historically associated with pre-collapse societies. She found evidence of political factions forming alliances with powerful corporations, creating miniature governments within the larger one. And then she saw the final message Elias had written before disappearing. If you're reading this, it means they found me. The pattern is real. Do not stop. The weight of his words settled on her like stone. Myra Calder was no longer just a journalist. She had become the only person with the full truth of Avalon's unraveling and the only one still willing to expose it. Myra Calder had always believed that truth brought clarity, that the more she uncovered, the safer she would feel. But as she followed the trail Elias had left, clarity only revealed how deep Avalon's fractures ran. The union of Avalon still glittered on the surface. Skyscrapers gleaming, news channels celebrating economic triumphs, leaders insisting the nation was stronger than ever. But beneath this polished mask, she was discovering a superpower quietly splitting along its seams. Her next step was to interview the individuals Elias had spoken to during his final months: retired generals, economists, former cabinet members, and analysts who had refused to stay silent. Many were reluctant to talk. Some agreed only under strict anonymity. A few begged her to forget the whole thing. But once they spoke, they confirmed Elias's theory with disturbing consistency. A former military strategist revealed that the armed forces were no longer unified. Internal ideological divisions had created 2 distinct blocs that barely cooperated, each convinced it represented the true future of Avalon. Drills were being performed separately, and intelligence sharing was quietly breaking down. A macroeconomist told Myra that the currency remained strong only because the world still believed in Avalon's stability. If that belief cracked, even slightly, the entire financial structure could wobble. Confidence is the last glue of a late-stage superpower, he said. Once it dissolves, nothing holds. Another expert, a sociologist, provided data showing trust in institutions had plunged to historic lows. Universities, courts, policing bodies, and regulatory agencies had all lost credibility. Instead of reform, leaders had doubled down on messaging campaigns to project confidence, never addressing the structural decay. Then came the most startling interview. A former senior government official, speaking from an anonymous location, grabbed Mira's recorder with trembling hands. "You don't understand," he said. "The federal government isn't one thing anymore. Two factions are forming inside it, two visions of Avalon's future. They spy on each other. They sabotage each other. Some agencies take orders from one faction. Others listen to the other. The Union is no longer united." For a moment, Mira could barely breathe. Elias had predicted fragmentation, not this level of internal rivalry. She now realized that Avalon's collapse was not being driven by foreign enemies or economic decline, it was being accelerated by its own guardians. Yet the public remained largely oblivious. National pride acted like a fog, dulling warning signs. News outlets focused on external threats, political spectacles, and celebrity scandals, drowning out the quiet groaning of a breaking system. People believed what they wanted to believe, that Avalon was too powerful to fall. This denial frightened Mira more than the shadow threats following her. She returned home to find her apartment door slightly open. Nothing was stolen, but her files had been moved subtle enough to deny, precise enough to warn her. A single note lay on her desk. "Stop digging or you'll join him." She knew who him meant. But instead of fear, a cold determination settled inside her. Elias had been silenced because he understood the pattern. She would not let his work vanish. The Union of Avalon might be blinded by pride, but she would drag the truth into the light, even if it meant risking everything. The night the lights went out across the Union of Avalon, Mira Calder felt the world cross an invisible threshold. She had been reviewing one of Elias's final encrypted files when her apartment suddenly plunged into darkness. The hum of the city outside her window, traffic, neon signs, electric billboards, fell silent. It was a strange, heavy silence, like the world had stopped breathing. Moments later, the horizon flickered. Entire districts went dark in rapid succession, like dominoes collapsing. At first, people assumed it was a regional outage. But then reports came in from across the country: banks frozen, hospitals offline, trains halted mid-track, communications failing. Within an hour, more than half of Avalon was paralyzed. The government quickly issued a statement blaming a foreign cyber attack. Phrases like state-sponsored aggression, external sabotage, and national retaliation under consideration spread across emergency broadcasts. But Mira had spent enough time inside Elias's files to recognize the pattern. A Stage 6 collapse institutional breakdown was not triggered by outsiders. It was born from inside. She rushed to her backup generator and powered up her secure laptop. Messages were flooding in from her sources. Military officers unable to reach their superiors, officials locked out of their own systems, state governors bypassing federal channels to coordinate emergency measures independently. One message caught her eye: a file from an anonymous whistleblower within the Central Intelligence Network. The file contained logs of the cyber attack. Mira's hand shook as she read the code signatures. These weren't foreign. These were internal, matching a covert operations unit she recognized from Elias's research. One faction inside the government had attacked another. It was a preemptive strike, a declaration of internal war. The next morning, the government doubled down on the foreign attack narrative. But Mira published her analysis within minutes, exposing the internal signatures she had found. The article spread faster than she expected. Citizens, already frustrated, began questioning everything. If the government could lie about this, what else were they hiding? Crowds gathered outside government buildings. Protests erupted in major cities. Some demanded accountability. Others demanded independence. The crisis was no longer technical, it was psychological. Trust collapsed. As the unrest spread, the government invoked emergency protocols, activating nationwide surveillance systems once intended only for wartime. Drones patrolled streets. Communication platforms were throttled. Borders were tightened. A curfew was issued, but none of it restored unity. It only confirmed that something deeper was falling apart. That evening, Mira received a brief, scrambled message from Elias Mero, the first sign he was still alive. Stage 7 has 2 endings. Choose the right one. The message cut out abruptly. Was he warning her? Guiding her? Or begging for help? Mira tried to trace the signal but failed. Someone was blocking her path at every turn. Meanwhile, Avalon seemed ready to split in two. Local governments began operating independently, and the federal authority was losing grip by the hour. The opposing factions inside the government were preparing new blows, each claiming to defend the Union by undermining it. Mira realized Elias's pattern wasn't a theory anymore. It was happening. And Stage 6 wasn't approaching, it had begun. The Union of Avalon was no longer simply unstable, it was tilting, like a great ship struck beneath the waterline. Every hour brought new fractures. State leaders refusing federal directives, military bases operating independently, and markets spiraling into fear-driven volatility. Mira Calder felt the air around her thicken with urgency. If the pattern continued, the next stage, Stage 7, would bring either dissolution or transformation. She didn't know which one. But she knew this. The truth could still steer the outcome. After days of hiding, Mira finally met with the mysterious contact who had been shadowing her online captain Rowan Holt, a brilliant but disillusioned intelligence officer. Holt had watched the government split into rival factions from the inside. He knew what Elias had been trying to expose. "You think the public knows the worst?" Holt told her as they sat inside a dim, abandoned warehouse. "They don't even know the beginning." Holt opened a briefcase and revealed a device capable of bypassing the government's highest-level encryption. With it, he said, they could access the classified network Elias had been investigating when he disappeared. Mira agreed instantly. Together, they broke into the internal servers, an act that carried a lifetime sentence if caught. But truth had become more important than law. What they found inside stunned even Mira. There was a fully compiled, confidential report confirming everything Elias had suspected. The government formally acknowledged. Avalon entered Stage 5 3 years earlier. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring the pattern in secret. Officials debated whether the nation could survive Stage 7 without major restructuring. 2 factions had emerged after disagreeing on how to preserve stability. Each faction had conducted covert operations against the other, including the blackout attack. And most damning of all, Elias Mero had been detained because his work risked exposing the internal conflict prematurely. Mira's stomach tightened. He wasn't missing, he had been silenced. She and Holt copied the files, but before they could escape, Holt intercepted a communication. Agents from both factions were closing in. They weren't trying to arrest them, they were trying to erase them. Mira realized something chilling. Neither faction wanted the public to know the truth. Both believed that exposure would accelerate the collapse, undermining their chance to seize control of Avalon's future. It wasn't a war for survival. It was a war for inheritance. As protests escalated nationwide, regional governors began discussing separation. Transit lines shut down, supply chains jammed. Rumors spread of military units defecting. Citizens prepared for unrest. Some stockpiled supplies, others fled the cities. Avalon was unraveling faster than any historian or strategist had predicted. Hunted from both sides, Mira and Holt fled across the country, moving from safe house to safe house, constantly watching the sky for drones and listening for the hum of surveillance units. Yet amid the chaos, the urgency of their mission sharpened. Mira understood the weight of Elias's warning. Stage 7 has two endings. If the people remained ignorant, Avalon would shatter. But if they knew the truth, if the full story reached every citizen, there might be a chance at rebirth. The files they carried were the only tool powerful enough to shift the nation's fate, and time was running out. The Union of Avalon hovered at the edge of the final threshold. Cities pulsed with unrest, military units chose sides, and the two internal government factions escalated their silent war. The streets filled with uncertainty, people hoarded supplies, boarded windows, and whispered about whether the Union would survive the week. It felt as if the nation held its breath, suspended between two futures. Mira Calder and Captain Rowan Holt had no more time to run. They had the files, the history, and Elias's full research, but every minute of hiding meant another fracture in the country. They needed a way to speak to the entire nation at once. The normal communication networks were heavily monitored, but Holt had a plan: dangerous, reckless, desperate. "We take the emergency broadcast grid," he said. Mira stared at him. "That's impossible. It's illegal," he corrected. "Not impossible. The Emergency Continuity Broadcast System, ECBS, was designed to override every screen, every phone, every radio in the Union. Only the highest authority could activate it. But with the system fractured by internal sabotage, there was a brief opening just wide enough for someone with Holt's expertise. They infiltrated an abandoned data relay center outside the capital. Mira uploaded Elias's files, the pattern, the evidence of internal sabotage, the factions, the government's secret acknowledgement of Stage 5, and the truth about Elias's capture. Holt worked quickly, hotwiring the ECBS transmitter while alarms blinked around them. Agents from both factions were already en route. "Now!" Holt shouted. Mira hit the final command. Across the entire nation, every screen flickered. Radios fell silent. The emergency alert tone wailed. And then the truth appeared: charts, documents, interviews, Elias's 7-stage pattern, everything laid bare. Mira stepped in front of the camera. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was unshakable. Avalon is not collapsing because of its people. It is collapsing because of secrecy. You deserve to know what has been happening behind closed doors. And you deserve a chance to shape what comes next. Her message spread to over 300 million people in seconds. In the streets, protests halted mid-chant. In bases, soldiers stopped preparing for orders that now seemed poisoned. Families gathered around screens, stunned. Leaders from both factions rushed to shut down the broadcast, but it was too late. The truth had escaped. The aftermath was chaotic. Some citizens raged. Others cried. But gradually, something unexpected happened. People began organizing not in anger, but in solidarity. Communities formed independent councils to maintain order, share resources, repair local infrastructures, and demand accountability from every level of government. Avalon's people chose cooperation over conflict. The elites, deprived of secrecy, lost their power struggle. Neither faction could claim legitimacy. Under nationwide pressure, they agreed to release political prisoners, one of whom was Elias Morrow. When Elias finally stepped into the sunlight, frail but alive, Mira was there to greet him. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she said. "The people did. Stage 7 had arrived." But instead of dissolution, something extraordinary happened. Avalon began to rebuild stronger because its people now understood how fragile strength truly was. Elias's pattern had been a warning, not a prophecy. And Avalon had chosen its own ending.